My screen, is that up for everybody?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful, excellent. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Emily Bovier, and I'm in the Department of Psychological Sciences here at SUNY Oswego. And my session today is titled Designing for Cognition: Accessible Practices for Neurodiversity. So, in terms of what we're going to cover for our agenda today, I have a basic overview of content that focuses on defining neurodiversity and understanding what we mean by differences in human cognition. And then I'll have an overview of basic principles of digital accessibility and universal design for learning as tools that we can use to design our campus experiences to be inclusive of those who are neurodivergent. And as far as some points for reflection, I will be talking a lot of this information in terms of classroom design, but we can think about this not only with specific applications to our courses, but overall campus initiatives and various spaces that we have on campus. And in general, the goal is to promote accessibility and inclusivity with respect to neurodiversity. So, a little bit about me. I identify as a neurodivergent ally. So, I have my youngest brother has autism. He is going to be 40 years old this year. So, a lot of my understanding of neurodiversity came just from my own lived experiences with a loved one who is autistic. I have also several loved ones who have characteristics of ADHD. And my passion for this came into the professional realm in 2021 when I was an accessibility fellow here at SUNY Oswego. And so I was able to consider inclusive practices and specifically designing materials to be accessible through the lens of understanding how neurodivergent individuals need specific accommodations or designing in mind to ensure that they have equal access to information. So that's my perspective, and that's where I am coming from with regard to this. This is an area that I've been getting into over the last few years and learning more about, rooted in my passion for inclusive practices in higher education. So, to start out with some basic terminology, neurodiversity is becoming much more talked about these days. And in general, this refers to just natural variation in human brains that yields differences in our cognitive and our perceptual processes. So, neurodiversity does exist on a continuum in many ways. We are all neurodiverse in some ways. It can be situation specific, it can be more trait specific. And then historically, we have understood neurodiversity in terms of clinical diagnoses. So, some examples that folks are most familiar with include autism spectrum disorders, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. Through the neurodiversity movement, we have come to understand anxiety and mood disorders such as depression and bipolar as falling under this neurodivergent umbrella. And we also have individuals who might have learning differences or intellectual disabilities that fall under this neurodiverse umbrella. In terms of the way that I approach neurodiversity in higher education, if we follow a strength-based model rather than a deficit-based model, we're going to set people up for success by focusing on assets of their individual differences to promote success. So, just a way to think about this. This is from a group of colleagues in 2023 who were characterizing a neurodiversity paradigm compared to a disorder paradigm. So, on the left hand of the screen, we have a visual that represents a way of thinking when considering a neurodiverse condition as some sort of disorder. And essentially, here, that model, the paradigm, considers those neurodevelopmental conditions with brain differences as a brain dysfunction. And the intervention focuses specifically on those differences in the brain and aims to develop interventions that target that particular brain dysfunction. And they consider behaviors that stem from those brain differences as a form of impairment, right, or disorder. But we can flip that paradigm, and especially in higher education, and look at a neurodivergent person's brain as simply atypical. It deviates from the average brain, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's disordered. In a way, we could think of it just simply as differences in how we think and how we do and how we are as humans. And so, from this neurodiversity paradigm approach, rather than focusing on the brain difference as a dysfunction or a disorder, and then use an intervention to target that specific process, instead, the intervention is shifted into affirming those people's lived experiences. So, you'll see how the figure on the right-hand side centralizes an atypical brain and focuses the intervention on a way to promote those strengths and give people a sense of acceptance, a sense of well-being, affirm their lived experiences, promote resiliency, and that will help set people up for success. And as we continue to learn more about neurodiversity, especially in higher education, we can design our experiences to ensure that we're focusing more on this strength-based approach and helping individuals maximize those strengths that they have and cater to those differences in thinking and processing to make sure that they have equal access to information and are equally able to succeed. So before we talk more specifically about some examples for neurodiversity, I just want to take a step back and talk about human cognition in general. And so what I'll do is we're walking our way through these different domains of human cognition. I'll give some examples primarily from autism spectrum disorders and ADHD. Especially if we're thinking about classroom learning, a student's experience in the classroom. But again, I'm encouraging everyone to think about these processes, not necessarily restricted just to the classroom, but just the experience on our campus more generally. So on the screen, we have a figure. I designed this figure with AI assistance to graphically represent these different domains of human cognition. And all of these cognitive processes work together in a synergistic way to result in some sort of behavior, right? So we have things like working memory and attention. Those are probably two of the biggest things that we think of with regard to our classroom engagement, right? Are our students paying attention and are they actively working with information, right? That's what our working memory is where we have new information coming in and we are actively working and retaining that information. So in order to be able to actively work with information, you first have to be able to pay attention, right? So there are differences in our ability to attend and to focus. This includes things like avoiding distractors. And those distractors could be things like sensory information in our environment. But even with something like ADHD, and it's typically for adults with ADHD, the distractors can be their own internal thoughts. So when we think of ADHD and how it manifests in childhood, usually you might see something like more activity, like children running around excessively or excessive extroverted behaviors. But as into adulthood, typically what we see is that the attention comes from a feeling of restlessness, and people can be distracted by their own internal dialogue, right? So there doesn't necessarily have to be an environmental distractor to disrupt attention. In terms of some other human cognitions, we have things like emotion regulation. So some people have difficulty regulating their emotional responses. And this can impact classroom behavior in terms of, as you know, we all have challenges within our lives that might lead to various emotional expressions. And some of us are better able to regulate those to become present and attend in a classroom environment, and others might have more challenges with that. Related to this, inhibitory control is a human cognition that it's just inhibiting our responses, right? Um, this can this can happen at both the neural level and the behavioral level. So a really great example of how it's happening at the level of the brain, we can tie this back to our attention. So right now, all of you are attending to this presentation. You are listening to me speak. If you are a sighted person, you are attending to the visuals on the screen. And you also have all of your extraneous stimuli in your environment. What our brain has to do is our brain has to inhibit neural signals for irrelevant information and focus on the information that is relevant. So, most likely, the sound of my voice and the visuals on the screen. Okay. Some people have difficulty with that neural inhibition, which then might translate to behavioral inhibition, right? Where, especially with something with ADHD, where students might feel the need to get up and out of their desk at times or fidget in their seat. They may have a difficult time inhibiting those behaviors. This also relates a lot to sensory information. So, in terms of our cognition, it's all rooted in sensory information, right? So, we have incoming sensory signals that our brain has to process and regulate to then focus our attention and to be able to actively work with information. So right now, we could even do just a short guided sensory activity where you pay attention to the various sensory information that you are experiencing. So right now, just even calling attention to my own sensory environment. I have my window open, so I have traffic out on the street that I'm hearing. My partner is still puttering around throughout the house. My knee is pressed up against the side of my desk. So I've just now paid attention to that sensory input. Even the feeling of the clothing on your body. What has now probably happened is that you're now probably very aware of it because I have called your attention to it. Some individuals might have a heightened sensory reaction. And essentially, what that means is that all of that sensory information that many of us are able to inhibit that signal and not pay attention to, some people's brains fire that neural signal in such a way that all of that sensory information is equally as salient and relevant. So it can be very difficult to filter out all of that sensory information to regulate your attention. Related to that, some sensory information can be very irritating, right? Which can cause some distress, which might feed back into some of that emotional regulation. If you're feeling that heightened irritability because of that, either distracting sensory information or actually disruptive or painful sensory information. Sometimes things like loud noises can be incredibly distressing to individuals. And then finally, we have social cognition. And social cognition essentially means how we derive information from social interactions. This can include things like understanding facial expressions, reading body language, and things like that. So I've drawn your attention to these types of human cognitions because I have some student testimonials that speak specifically to these cognitive processes. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. There are many different cognitive processes. Executive functioning tends to encompass all of these different human cognitions. But these are ones that feel the most relevant to understanding our students who may have autism spectrum disorders or ADHD. All right, so in terms of this overarching theme of designing with cognition in mind and being inclusive of neurodivergent individuals, When we design with cognition in mind, it's beneficial for all members of our campus community. So even those individuals who do not identify as neurodivergent, as I mentioned, our human cognition can be diverse in terms of day to day, right? And so the way that we design with cognition in mind can be beneficial for everybody. In general, this helps combat systemic barriers and protect against the hidden curriculum. So a lot of times we talk about the hidden curriculum in higher education with regard to first generation students who might not be familiar with some of the terminology or some of the processes in higher education that we might make assumptions about. And so they might not have equal access to information and be able to understand the information if there are aspects of our design or our learning processes that are hidden. And so that can happen with neurodivergent individuals as well because of their differences in cognition. And so we'll talk about different principles that we can use to ensure that we are making things transparent and explicit for our students. And also in general, with regard to inclusivity, it promotes just overall well-being. So we promote inclusion, we celebrate authentic identities, and we reduce stigma. And I have some testimonials from students about how that stigma can impact their overall sense of self and well-being as well. And so one thing that I do want to bring up is that, and I've heard a lot of this anecdotally from my students with autism, is that there is a process called autistic masking. And this is essentially where individuals with autism are aware of what neurotypical behaviors are. And so they are able to mask some of their neurodivergent behaviors. It could be something as simple as forcing themselves to make eye contact when engaged in a conversation with someone, because they have learned that that is the neurotypically expected behavior. So they can mask their autistic traits when in classes or when around neurotypical peers. That repeated masking can be incredibly draining for people. And with combined stressors over time can lead to something called autism burnout. Autism burnout is very different than the way that we typically use the term burnout. I'm sure most of us here have experienced burnout at some point in our professional careers or in our personal lives. But autism burnout is a very specific phenomenon that happens when individuals with autism have had prolonged stressors, especially as a result of masking and sort of having to hide their autistic traits. And sometimes burnout can lead to prolonged episodes of people withdrawing and failing to take care of themselves, right? So it can be a pretty severe episode that might mirror something like a depressive episode. And so this has a very significant impact on well-being. So by being conscious of our neurodivergent students' experiences, we can help ensure that we are celebrating their authentic selves, providing inclusive access, which will ultimately impact their overall well-being. Okay, so I want to talk about some student testimonials, just to share with you the lived experiences of our students, because I find that hearing from our students directly is a really great way to help motivate people to understand their lived experiences and to start practicing some of these inclusive principles. So I asked my students who are in my neurodiversity seminar, many of them are very willing to disclose that they are neurodivergent. And so I asked students to volunteer some of their responses regarding some of these different cognitive processes and how it may impact their learning experiences. So this first one here is about sensory load. And I recognize that there's a lot of text on this slide, so I'm going to guide you through it. We'll read through this, and I'll talk about some of the implications of this particular testimonial. So this is a student who says that my sensory overload occurs mainly when there's loud stimuli I don't like. Music is a good example of sensory stimulation I like, but large crowd speaking or ambient shuffling in a classroom are things that I regularly disengage from. And so that piece about regularly disengaging is really important because for me, for example, as a neurotypical classroom instructor, I am able to remain focused even if my students are shuffling their papers, getting up from their desks. If the air vent in the room is particularly loud, or if there is activity in the hallway, I am able to maintain my attention and focus. But students who are susceptible to sensory overload can lead to disengagement if they have even what I might perceive as very minimal sensory stimulation. So that is an example of how sensory information can lead a student to disengage in the classroom. Now, this particular student has a tactic to help manage his sensory overload. So for him, music itself can override a lot of the smaller, more consistent and irritating noises by keeping things on an overall volume level with my professor, which is typically why I opt to put in AirPods during class. So I've talked with this student. I knew that he would put AirPods in sometimes halfway through class, he would put them in. And I knew for him that that was a sign of engagement. He was using that as a tool by having music on a relatively low volume to help sort of mask the other irritating noises so that he was better able to focus on me in the classroom. The reason I like to talk about this one is because I know many professors have policies about using things like earbuds in their classroom. So I encourage everyone to think about their policies that they have and recognize when there might be an opportunity for a student to use that as a tool as opposed to a distraction. So always keep that in mind when thinking about some of the classroom policies that you might have. All right, I'm going to switch to memory and attention. So we have a testimonial here that talks about attending to information in real time and also how it relates to being able to actively retain that information later on. So this student says, I often forget passing mentions of things such as homework or later assignments when they're mentioned in the beginning of class. And this particular student was not permitted to take out their phone and write it down. And they say they almost always forget right afterwards. So that particular student uses their cell phone as a tool to be able to jot down what they perceive as passing mentions of things at the beginning of a class, let's say. Memory is especially hard for this student as they can go an entire day completely fixated on something else. This is very characteristic of autism spectrum disorders. This student identifies as autistic, but this is also very characteristic of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder as well, where people with ADHD can really focus in on something to a point where they are fixated on it, failing to use the bathroom, failing to eat, things like that. So an entire day can consume a person's fixation, and they might realize later. So this student says, only to realize there was an assignment due at 11:59 when I'm in bed at 12:30. What I like about this student is they admit that this could be 100% my fault, but if there are tools in place that could help them that are not there, it makes it more likely that this student is going to miss an assignment. So having a consistent schedule can help this student. If there is not a consistent schedule, it's more likely that if he is fixated on something, his cognition remains fixated on that and does not switch over to remembering that he has a task to complete, or if there's not something up on Brightspace. So we can talk about practices that ensure that there are consistencies in how you schedule assignments in your class or how students engage with your class outside of the classroom by using things like the Brightspace course shell and consistent announcements for students. All right, and then finally, we have a testimonial on social cognition. Again, this is how we are deriving information from social interactions. So this particular student says, when I'm paired with neurotypical classmates, and they disengage from me despite my attempts to be friendly and engaged from what I can assume is my lack of eye contact and blunt or humorless word choices. So individuals with autism might have very blunt affect, right? So the intonations or fluctuations in their voice might not be there. Um, Eye contact might not be present. And neurotypical people rely on those signals as a way to engage with others. And so this might be an implicit bias from other students where they are disengaging from this autistic student without necessarily realizing what they're doing. In this case, this student says that he never really knows when he's not deriving social interaction to the fullest because he assumes that his encounters are one-dimensional. When I talked with this student afterwards, he said that when he interacts with neurodivergent peers, other peers with autism, he says it feels like a sixth sense. They understand each other and they're able to relate very well. With regard to his interactions with his professors, this student says that my professors sometimes take me as rude and disengage from helping me on some occasions, which again, it could be an implicit bias where we are misinterpreting a student's behavior as rude or entitled or something like that, when it's simply just a characteristic of their neurodivergence. A note here is that this student has gotten much better at masking, so it's becoming less and less of a problem. So you might think, oh, wonderful, this student has learned to cope by masking, and therefore his interactions with his professors might be more positive. But remember that there is a trade-off, that masking can cause a lot of distress, especially over time. So we need to take these things into consideration. All right. And then finally, I have a testimonial from a student. I had several students identify their own strengths and challenges in classroom or higher education environments. And so I wanted to pull this one because I felt like it was a great representation of this neurodiversity paradigm, how we can focus on strengths and assets, but then also recognize what happens or the effects of when people consider it more of a disorder paradigm. So in terms of the strengths, the student says, I am a dedicated, passionate, intelligent, capable of making connections and parallels between subjects that further illuminates the material, meticulous, fine eye for details, good at writing, and ambitious. Amazing, wonderful things. It's so heartwarming to know that students are able to identify all of these strengths. But then when you look at the flip side and the challenges, you can see the struggles that this student has where they burnt themselves out trying to do everything perfectly. And a lot of their anxiety stems from from not having reasonable teachers in the past. And they fear people losing patience with them, leaving them, or giving up on them. Okay, so you have this wonderful strength-based approach, but also recognizing that if we are not designing inclusive spaces, the fear that this student has of somebody losing patience or giving up on them is really profound as well. Okay, so that is a basic overview of neurodiversity in terms of differences in human cognition. And I've talked a little bit about how it can manifest in classroom experiences. And again, I encourage you to think of it in terms of other spaces that you're in as well. So for example, for me, as a supervisor, as a chair of the department, I keep these things in mind when working with my faculty because I may have neurodivergent faculty who can benefit from these inclusive designs. So now I want to talk a little bit about two approaches to inclusive designing things with cognition in mind. So we have universal design for learning, and then we have basic principles in digital accessibility, okay? And I encourage you all to think about ways that you might be able to make small modifications to either your classes or the way that you run meetings, and recognize how you might be able to design something that is more accessible for differences in cognition. So for universal design for learning, the CAST UDL guidelines essentially are ensuring that all learners are able to access and participate in meaningful, challenging learning opportunities. And to do that, you can design multiple means of, and the first component is engagement. Essentially, what we're talking about here is how students stay motivated and involved. So, as you're designing your classroom experiences or other learning opportunities, you can design options for welcoming interests and identities, sustaining effort, and emotional capacity. Tying this back to those differences in cognition. Okay, so we have students who, and again, this applies to all students, right? So using universal design for learning will not only make these experiences more accessible for neurodivergent students, but it will be equally beneficial for all students. So when you have options in your classes to welcome students' individual interests and their authentic identities, that will help them be more motivated. So this could be something like giving students choices for assignments where they can choose one of 3 topics to write about. Or it can be an open-ended topic choice where they can bring something that's authentic to themselves, something that they're interested in, that you can then apply to the broader learning objectives that you have for the assignment. This will also help sustain effort, right? Because if we are helping students stay motivated and involved, students who struggle with sustaining their attention over time, like students with ADHD or with autism, if it's something that they feel engaged with, they're likely able to overcome some of the challenges that they might experience with sustaining their attention, especially with longer assignments or projects. And then finally, emotional capacity, right? So we talked about how individuals have differences in their emotional regulation. And so by having these tools for engagement, you can perhaps offset some of the emotional regulation challenges that students might have because they might be less frustrated, right? If they're focusing on something that they're really interested in, they understand why it's relevant to them. It can sort of eliminate some of the frustrated reactions that could lead to something like giving up and not continuing on. Okay, the second component of universal design for learning is to design multiple means of representation. And this refers to how students access information. So this includes things like if you are using PowerPoint slides, how you design your PowerPoint slides, how you lecture, how you structure classroom activities, how you structure your assignments. If you're leading a meeting, you could think about how you are structuring your agenda or the way that you are verbally communicating with people in a meeting. The idea here is that there are design options for perception. So that can include things like sensory information, right? On PowerPoint slides, if you have a lot of distracting visuals or excessive movement on your slides, that can lead to difficulty in perception because people might not be able to equally access that information if they are distracted by other sensory information. In terms of language and symbols, oftentimes we can think about this, kind of relates a little bit back to the hidden curriculum for using explicit language, right? So if you have acronyms, right, spell things out. We can think about this a lot for students who have English as a second language as well, but it still also applies to neurodivergent students. If you are using symbols to represent something, make sure that that is clear. And ways to build knowledge over time, right? So how they are accessing information, that building knowledge piece could be like scaffolding information over time for these students. And I am speaking about UDL very broadly here, but the goal is for folks to just think about 1 or 2 small changes. If any of these UDL principles resonate with you, we'll have some time for reflection with this as well. All right, and finally, the third principle for universal design for learning is designing multiple means of action and expression. And this refers to how students demonstrate their learning. So you have options for ways that students can interact, whether it's interacting with each other in the classroom, um, or interacting with the course materials. So this could be something like multiple modes of demonstrating their learning with their expression and communication, for example. Um, this could be something like giving alternatives for assignments. So, for example, I have presentations in my class, and I allow students options to do in-person presentations or virtual presentations. And the students are very clear that neither one is a cop-out, right? Both opportunities rely on different professional development skills. And we are in a virtual setting right now, essentially. So students understand that by doing virtual presentations, they are developing a different skill set as well, which might make them more comfortable in being able to express what they are learning. If a student is very uncomfortable with an in-person presentation, they might be able to fully express their understanding, but the context itself is basically creating a barrier for them to be able to fully demonstrate what they have learned in that context. So that action and expression is really important to think about. How can we design multiple ways for students to demonstrate what they have learned, keeping in mind that we have these differences in cognition, and that individuals might be able to demonstrate their learning in different ways. Okay, so the other piece of content that I want to share with you in terms of designing inclusive experiences has to do with digital accessibility. We have a work group here at SUNY Oswego, I'm sure everyone is familiar with, that talks about 5 basic principles of digital accessibility. I'll walk you through the 5 basic principles and sort of highlight how it relates to differences in cognition and how it can lead to more inclusive experiences. So structured content is basically the idea of using headings and subheadings and paragraphs and lists in your documents, in your syllabi, in your PowerPoint slides. This helps people follow along with the information. So you could imagine this slide being designed in a different way, where it's just a wall of text as opposed to the heading that identifies what the slide is talking about, the basic principles of digital accessibility. I've chosen to use bullets here instead of a numbered list, but it organizes the information in a way that makes it easier for people who might have attention difficulties to focus in and remain on track with the information. In terms of using text equivalents, this includes things like if you have an image on your PowerPoint slide, you provide an alt text that describes what the image is. This could be very helpful. Obviously, this is used for people who might have visual difficulties, and so, or they're using a screen reader, and so the alt text can read to them and describe the image to them if they are not a sighted person. But if you think about students who might have difficulty focusing in class, and you have spent a good amount of time using a diagram, like I did earlier in this presentation, providing the alt text afterwards gives them access to that full information if they had difficulty focusing in real time when you were describing the diagram. Captions for videos, transcripts for recordings, all of that information is helpful and ensures that people have equal access to information. In terms of using color carefully, that has to do with usually with contrast, right? And again, from a human cognition standpoint, we're talking about the idea of being able to maintain your attention. I have been at presentations where if the color contrast is not quite right and I can't see it, I'm going to disengage, right? Even if it's a very boisterous speaker who I'm able to attend to, I'm still missing out on something if I don't have that visual access. If they have designed slides for me to access in that way, they're useful for something, but I'm not able to access them because I'm not able to see and process the information the same way. With descriptive hyperlinks, that again can help as people are navigating through information, not only for folks who are using screen readers, but just in general, when processing, especially large bodies of text and needing to navigate to a hyperlink, if that link is descriptive and actually states what the link is, as opposed to something brief like here or click this, it can be difficult to maintain a line of thinking and understanding if you don't have descriptive hyperlinks. And finally, the last bit is clear language. So using clear and concise language in your assignments, in your notes for your class, in the way that you speak to students to make sure that they're able to fully attend to the information. If you're using a lot of jargon, or even something like sarcasm, right, can be misinterpreted if you think about that social cognition aspect, where we derive information from somebody's tone of voice or something like that. You want to keep in mind how a neurodivergent person might not be able to interpret the information the way that you're intending if you're not using clear language. Okay, so I have some reflection questions for folks to think about. Let's see, we've got a little less than 10 minutes left, but in general, this session addressed individual differences in cognition and accessible practices to be inclusive of those who are neurodiverse. I'm happy to open up the floor if folks have questions or would like to answer some of these reflection questions to think about any specific applications that you identified, whether it's in your courses, your supervisory work, other campus initiatives. And then in general, how might we be able to use this information to further promote accessibility and inclusivity? Before we end here, I will share all these slides with everybody because I know some folks popped in. There are some professional development opportunities coming up here as well that will be very excellent for those of you that would like to continue on understanding how to design inclusive practices for neurodivergent individuals. All right. Anyone have any questions or reflections that they would like to share? Okay. Well, thank you so much for everyone for coming. Grace, I saw you unmuted. Did you want to share something? Go for it.
Yeah, I wanted to say thank you. I've attended these throughout the years that you've offered them, and I appreciate it every time, just kind of as a regrounding and just remembering, where to start and where to start thinking about things. One of the things I've learned in working in this office and the dean of students is faculty are often unsure if a student is neurodiverse, but they're presenting in some ways. Do you have recommendations on how they can approach the conversation or start making these changes without, knowing for sure,
Yeah,
right? Like I think
yeah,
there's this weird gray area that faculty really struggle with sometimes. And I am one of them too, right? Like when I have a student in my class and I'm like, I'm not really sure what's going to work for this student. I've kind of gone to the way of like, do it for everyone. Everyone benefits. And so it doesn't hurt to make some changes when you notice something. And I've kept those changes in my curriculum and in the way I approach things. I haven't changed back once I make the changes. But do you have recommendations for faculty who aren't quite sure or also don't know about the workload of changing their stuff if they're not sure?
that's a really great question. And so the way that you approached it is excellent. The idea here is design from the get-go with this in mind. And by doing so, you remove the burden from the student to have to disclose. And many of our students might not have official accommodations, right? So there are many students who don't have that letter, right? But can still experiencing some of these characteristics and can still benefit from this design. And as you mentioned, all students benefit as well. So I think the awareness is key. And then, even if you have one student where you learn something from and you make that small change, just keep that change going. Um, What I do is I always in my syllabus and on the first day of class, I talk about my philosophy of designing an inclusive classroom, right? So I ensure that students know that I welcome all identities into the classroom. It is meant to be a safe space. They are welcome to talk with me. Anecdotally, I've just talked to other colleagues and I've noticed that, like my class, I know how many students are neurodivergent because they are very comfortable talking with me. Other colleagues have the same students and they don't know, right? And it's about the tone that you set. And so the fact that 50% of my students identify as neurodivergent, whereas other colleagues think they just have one or two students in their class, it's a big tell, right? In terms of how you set the tone for your class. So I think that would be the biggest approach. And just saying that you're willing to work with them. I am not an expert in all things, and I approach it as we will learn together, right? If there is something that you need, we will learn together, because I will mess up sometimes, right? I might design an experience that I think is inclusive, but I have inadvertently put a barrier up. But please come talk with me. Um, and small steps, right? So there's lots of workshops on universal design for learning, for example. And I know when Chris Hermalick started this off for our Digital Accessibility Summit, the way he approached it was one small change, right? One small change. And usually that's the only signal students need. If they see that you're making one small effort, they will feel comfortable in talking with you, sharing their experiences. Um, but it is a big lift, right? It can be a big lift if you're starting from the ground up to redesign your materials or the way that you approach classes or meetings. But it becomes a habit over time as well. The more that you embed it into your practices, it will become habitual. Yeah, great question.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead. Go ahead, Lynn.
Unmute, Lynn.
Oh, am I on? Okay. Um, Emily knows this already, and I'm sure some of you already know this already. But I first just thank you for this presentation. As Grace said, it's a really good reminder of what we should be doing and making those small changes. But as I said, many people know that my older son has autism, and he's pursuing a PhD in psychology studying autism. So you might hear his name in the future. Um, but one thing that helps me in the classroom is telling students that I have a son with autism. And just starting with that, I've been given permission by my son to talk about it, right? So
Mhm,
that's something to keep
mhm,
in mind if you have family members or friends, if they give you permission to chat about it, which is, of course, is important.
mhm.
But just mentioning that he has autism and that he's in grad school and he's doing well and um, is really important, I think, for students to hear, and important for them to know that, I'm an ally for them, and that we can talk about things. And as you said, Emily, and Grace, you don't ask students about these things. You can't, and they are not
Right.
supposed to tell you. But in my experience, as Emily knows and has experienced, you can pretty much tell the students who are on the spectrum or who have issues. Um, and the key, as you already said, is dealing with them individually and just
Mhm.
trying to adapt as best you can. Sometimes you can't, right? So
Right.
sometimes there's something you cannot do for them. And that's where you might refer to them to accessibility resources. Like the people in accessibility resources are awesome about giving advice. So I highly
Mhm.
recommend going to them because they might give you more options for things. You mentioned presentations. I had a student who had severe anxiety who just could not do a presentation either on Zoom or in person.
Mhm.
And I spoke to Pat in Accessibility Resources, and he said, why not have them record the presentation, but then they have to be present for questions.
Right. Mhm.
And that was a really great option. I thought, okay, I'm okay with that. So sometimes you just need other people around. And my other question, just to ask, is Emily, is there some kind of faculty board or faculty sort of resource community that people can go to? Is that some? I know we've talked about this before, so
Yeah, no, this is something that I would love to be able to get started. I don't know what context to start it in, like some sort of advisory board or Yeah, mutual support group or something like that. It could be a subdivision of CELT in some way. Like we have these sessions, and that's usually where folks come together to talk about these things. But some sort of standing board in some way would be very helpful, right? Like we have the work group on accessibility practices, but that tends to be very, very broad, and this is a more specific. And another thing I should mention, even though I talked about ADHD and autism very broadly, especially with autism, and Lynn and I have talked about this too, you've met a person with autism, you've met one person with autism. It is so difficult to put everybody into a single box, right? We know these broad characteristics and we have these broad approaches that will help most students, but every student is so individual in terms of their experiences. And I think the biggest thing is just reducing the stigma. Reduce the stigma, make them feel like they belong. And that's going to go a really, really long way, and challenge them, right? They want to be challenged and know that you have confidence in them, that they are able to meet that challenge that you are giving them in the classroom. They will rise to that if they know that you have confidence in them and you think that they can achieve it. So a lot of it is really just the tone that you set and the practices that you use and your willingness and transparency too. Like I've designed this assignment for this way to be accessible to all students without having to single out any one person or any one characteristic that a person might have. Yeah, I think those are the biggest approaches. But it's a good question, Lynn, and something that I should consider further about how to form some sort of active working group for people to go to on a regular basis, not necessarily just during breakout sessions. Yeah.
And maybe the reading group could be a good basis for getting that started. One other
Yes.
thing, going back to Grace's question, since we can't ask students about their health issues and so forth, just doing a survey of students, or including in the syllabus, asking students that they reveal any concerns they've had or problems that they've had and make any suggestions on how they could be better supported, because that would address a whole variety of issues.
Absolutely. Yep. I do that at the start of every semester with a student information sheet. It's private, right? They don't have to say it on the first day in front of everybody. And again, it just sets the tone. It knows that you are willing to work with them and willing to accommodate them if need be. I just put my slides into the chat for everybody because the last slide does have those professional development opportunities. And one is the fall reading group that John mentioned. So that will be just an excellent way to start bringing people together. All right. Well, thank you very much. I believe we are at time, a few minutes past time. So I really appreciate you all being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I'll stop the recording.